Welcome back to Project Lekutei Sichos. We will be studying today the second Sicha for Parshas Nitzovim in volume 19, Chelik Yutes, which begins on page 266, and it is on a Rashi, one of the first Rashis in the Parsha. The Parsha begins with Moshe Rabbeinu telling the people that they are all assembled that day in order to go through a bris, a covenant with Hashem. Who is assembled? So Moshe Rabbeinu enumerates 10 levels of Yidden who were there, and he says that all of them are included in the bris. Then he continues with the posuk on which the Rashi that we're studying comments. The posuk says, "V'loi idchem levadechem." It is not with you alone. Onochi kodesh es abris hazois ve'es ho'olo hazois. It's not with you alone that I'm forming this covenant and this oath. Rather, with those who stand with us here today before Hashem our God, and with those who are not with us here today. Rashi cites from the posuk, the Eis Asher Einenu Poi, and with those who are not here. He cites those 4 words from the posuk, Eis Asher Einenu Poi, and Rashi short comment, Va'af im doirois ho asidim lihiyois. Also with the generations that are destined to follow, that are destined to be, meaning in the future. He's making a pact also with future generations. What does Rashi want? And what does he add? So the commentators on the Rashi, the Rebbe brings 5 or 6 of them in a footnote, they understand that in order that we not misunderstand the posuk to mean that there were Yidden who were living at that time, but were not present at that assembly, therefore the posuk says that Moshe tells them, I'm making the pact and the bond and the covenant with those who are not present as well. That's the way we might understand the posuk, but that doesn't fit with the beginning of the posuk, beginning of the parsha. All of you stand assembled today. So how do we fit the two? On the one hand, those who are not present. On the other hand, everybody is present. That's why Rashi explains he's talking about future generations, and they are not yet present. They haven't even been born yet. That's the way the commentators on Rashi understand his question and answer. But, says the Rebbe, that's not a sufficient explanation. After all, from the fact that the posuk tells us at the very beginning, all of you stand assembled today, so we understand right away, even without Rashi, that those who are not present could not mean those who were alive at that time but did not attend that assembly. Why does Rashi have to tell us a new idea to avoid a misunderstanding, and he says that we're talking about future generations, so that by itself would not be enough. Therefore, the commentators add that without Rashi, we wouldn't have thought that it's possible to form a covenant with someone unborn. How do you make a pact with something non-existent? Therefore, Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu is saying Hashem is making a pact even with the succeeding generations, which tells us a new idea that you can in fact make such a pact with generations yet to be born. Why can you? So they offer two reasons. One, the neshamos, the souls of those as yet unborn generations were present, and it is with the souls that the pact was made. Alternately, a second reason, because those yet to be born are children of those who are alive currently. We have a rule that the Gemara teaches, bro, karo, davua. A child is literally the leg, meaning an extension of the father. So the future generations are an extension of the current generation. So by making a pact with the current generation, that binds also the future generations who are an extension of the ones present. That's the way the Meforshim understand, and they show that, according to them, Rashi is showing us a new rule that you can, in fact, make a pact with generations to come, either with the neshamas or with the children, because they are an extension of the current generation. Says the Rebbe, still not clear. We know it's a cardinal rule, especially in the Rebbe's way of learning Rashi, that Rashi wrote his commentary so that it could be understood by a child starting out to learn Chumash at age 5. And that child should be able to understand what Rashi is telling him. That child doesn't know the rule that that a son or a child is an extension of his parent legally. It hadn't shown up in the previous Parshas until now in Torah. He also doesn't know whether or not the souls of future generations are present at the time of this bris. Rashi doesn't say they were. He just says that the pact was with future generations as well. But who is there from those future generations? So can you assume that the child knows that the souls were there? So Rashi ought to have explained how it's possible. Not only state that Hashem made the pact with future generations, but also explain how it's possible to make a pact with future generations, either with their souls or by extension of the present generation. Secondly, the question is magnified and exacerbated by the fact that a child knows that there have been oaths and bonds placed on future generations. It happened earlier. It happened when Yosef made his brothers swear that they would take his remains to Eretz Yisrael. But another 200 years or so would go by before Yosef's remains were ready to be taken out of Egypt to Eretz Yisrael with the Geula of Yidden from Mitzrayim. So it's not the brothers that have to commit themselves, but their children, their great-great-grandchildren. So we see that he made a pact with his brothers which would bind his great-grandchildren. Rashi doesn't find it necessary there to explain how you can make a pact with successive generations. Why does he find it necessary here? We find further, said the Rebbe, that Hashem made a pact with Avraham Avinu that he would give his descendants many generations later the land of Eretz Yisrael. Likewise, we also have this pact with future generations in Parshas B'chukoistai, where Hashem says what would happen to future generations if they follow or chas v'sholem don't follow Hashem's ways. In fact, most of the mitzvahs which Moshe was told to instruct the Eden would only apply in a future generation. So there too, Rashi should have explained how it's possible and say that, yes, you can make a pact with future generations. Rashi does not find it necessary to explain. Why here? Fourthly, the Gemara, when expressing this idea, says that Asher Einenu, those who are not present, whom Moshe Rabbeinu says he's making a pact with them too, refers to future generations and those who would convert in the future. That's simple, even not according to the method of Gemara, but even according to the method of Pshat, which is Rashi's method. So we understand that Gerim converts are included in this pact, just as they're included in the general instruction to follow Torah mitzvahs. In fact, the Gerim are included as one of the 10 categories of Yidden that Moshe Rabbeinu says, all of you are assembled here, and he enumerates 10 levels, Gerim among them. And you're all assembled here to go through the bris with Hashem, your God. So clearly it's with Gerim. Why does Rashi omit from the Gemara the mention of Gerim? And he only talks about Doiros Hoasidim Liyos, the generations which would arise in the future. Now, concerning Gerim, you can't explain in any one of the two ways which the Meforshim explain how it's possible to make a covenant with future generations, either with the souls or because the future generation is an extension of their parents, the current generation. But you can't say either one about the Gerim of the future. They are not children of current Eden, and their souls, by the lights of a 5-year-old studying Chumash, they're new souls. These souls weren't around at the time of the bris that Moshe Rabbeinu made with them. So how do we explain that future pact in connection with Gerim? Rashi doesn't explain it. On the other hand, since it's logical to assume that the bris, the covenant, was also with the Gerim of the future, so why does Rashi say only generations to be? And sixthly, this is a fine point, an expression that Rashi uses, doirois ho'asidim lihiois, generations which are yet to be in the future. Now that's not such a common phrase. In the Gemara, it doirois haboy, the coming generations, much simpler, much more usual. Why does Rashi choose the language of a Medrash Tanchuma rather than the more common, simple language of the Gemara? And lastly, why does Rashi, in his citation from the Pasuk, which seems to explain only the two words, Einenu boy, those who are not here? That's what Rashi is explaining, and his explanation is that it refers to future generations. So why does he bring in his citation also the words ve'eis asher einenu boy? The two first words, those who are not here. And not only does he bring them in his citation, but in the beginning of his explanation, Rashi says, Av im doires asidim liyos. Also, the pact is also with the future generations which are yet to be. What does that add? So the Rebbe takes a new tack, and he says, Rashi doesn't have to explain how it's possible to make a pact with future generations. After all, this pact and this covenant is with Hashem. For Hashem, this generation, that generation, it's all the same. You can make a pact with the future just like with the present. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu who's making the pact. Moshe Rabbeinu is only leading them or preparing them or doing the sign of the covenant, which different Meforshim say was there, although it's not recorded in the Chumash, what the sign of the covenant was, like taking the blood and dividing it in two, as was done before Matan Torah as a sign of the covenant. But that was Moshe Rabbeinu's involvement, preparing, making the signs, but the pact is not with Moshe. Moshe is with Eden. He's one of the Eden who are engaging in a pact, in a covenant with Hashem. Since the covenant with Hashem, so nobody's surprised that it can include future generations. So Rashi has no need to explain how it's possible. And that also explains why Rashi finds it unnecessary to explain how Hashem could give mitzvahs for future generations, or promise Avraham Avinu make a pact with him to give Eretz Yisrael to his future descendants, because we're talking about Hashem. What does Rashi find it necessary to explain? It's about the way in which that covenant was made with future generations. The Pasuk expresses itself not only with you am I making this covenant, but with those who are present and those who are not present. From that expression, we understand that this covenant is not only meant to bind future generations by means of a covenant made now. The covenant is with those future generations directly. And in the same way as the covenant with the present generation is direct, so too is the covenant with future generations direct, not through the present. And this is underscored even more from the fact that the Torah says that all of you stand assembled today to go through a bris a covenant with Hashem our God, where after saying all of you are assembled, he repeats again, not only with you, but also with those who are not present. Why is that repetition necessary? But it's in order to include future generations in the same way that the present generation is making a pact with Hashem. Therefore, Rashi, in his citation from the Pasuk, cites those two words, ve'eis asher einenu po, and with those who are not present today. And thereby he underscores that the covenant was directly made with those unborn generations, and that it's in the same way as the covenant with the present generation. Accordingly, it works out that not only does Rashi not need to add that Hashem makes a covenant with future generations because their souls were present, or because the future generation is an extension of the current one. No, that's the opposite of what Rashi wants to say. If we say that it's because the soul's being present, then it's not like the covenant with the present generation, where the covenant was with them as a body and a soul. And if we say that it's with the present generation, and thereby, by extension, because the future generation is an extension of the current one, then it's not direct. That's why Rashi does not add those explanations. But the way Rashi understands it, that the postscript implies that the covenant is with the future generation, just like the present one. So it means with the future generations, as they are souls clothed in bodies, living people. This is especially underscored by what Rashi says, that the reason the verb to make you pass through the covenant, why is the word to make you pass through? Pass through what? Where? So Rashi explained the word lo'ovrocho, to make you pass through, that this is the way they would do a bris. They would make partitions on either side, and the parties to the covenant would pass in between. And that is an indication that all those who pass through are united, they're like one being by this covenant. In this case, they're united with Hashem and with each other. So that we surely understand that the covenant is with all of them equally. And now we can understand why Rashi does not mention the Gerim, the converts of the future. Because according to Rashi, the covenant with those who are not present is directly with them. So that clearly it includes the Gerim. We don't need the Gerim's neshamas to be here now. The covenant is with them not now, but with them as they are in the future. So of course that includes the Gerim as well. On the contrary, Rashi cannot mention Gerim and single them out, because then it's different from the bris with those present, that all of them are there in the same bris, and therefore they're all one thing. Earlier in the Parsha, the Gerim are mentioned as a category because Moshe Rabbeinu is saying all of you are assembled here, and he enumerates 10 different levels and categories of Yidden. So there it makes sense to mention the Gerim as a category. But when we're talking about making the bris, in which they're all equal, so what sense does it make to single out the Gerim? Based on all that, we can also understand Rashi's choice of language. Instead of bringing from the Gemara the words, the coming generation, Rashi chooses the words of the Tanchuma, the generations who are yet to be. Why so? Coming generations implies that they're coming from the current one. They are a follow-up to the current generation. So when we use that terminology, of course, it means that those generations are yet unborn, but the implication is that they're continuing what was done before them from the current generation, as if to say that the covenant was with the current generation, and then through that, following up with the future generations. But Rashi doesn't want that. Rashi wants to say that it's with the future generation themselves, and therefore he chooses a language which implies that they're separate from the current generation. They don't exist yet. They are yet to come. The Rebbe concludes with a lesson, as the Rebbe often does. He takes from Rashi the wine of Torah. He takes a life lesson from the words of Rashi. The lesson is like this. It's possible that a person should sometimes feel on a low. He lacks the strength to carry out his avodas Hashem in Torah and mitzvahs, especially when it comes to going out of his comfort zone and affecting everybody in the world around him, spreading Yiddishkeit. He feels that he doesn't have the ability to do it. He's a minority among the nations. How can I stand up to a whole world? So the response to this can be gleaned from our Rashi. The fact that we are a minority compared to the world around us is only when we're counting numbers. How many Yidden, how many are alive today, versus how many others in the world. Numbers are limited, and measurement, time, and space. And because of that, indeed, we can be a minority among the nations. But since for a Yid, the main thing is his spiritual content, his Torah, his mitzvahs. So when a Yid connects with the Eibishter through studying Torah and performing mitzvahs, which are beyond time, they're timeless, then we're truly connected with all Yidden in all the generations throughout history. And then we're not a minority anymore. We are, in fact, more numerous and more powerful than those around us, who count for their numbers and their physical beings. And that's emphasized by Rashi saying, V'af im doiros, also with the generations who are yet to come. Just like the generation we stood assembled that day with Moshe Rabbeinu for the bris with Hashem, were included Yidden in all the generations. all of them who stood together to go through the breeze, they're all one being. From this, we understand that when a Yid is connected, clearly, obviously, actively with Hashem, with his bris, through fulfilling the Torah and the mitzvahs in actual deed, then he stands with all Yidden in that generation, and with all generations, all of them together are one gestalt. And then Yidden are not a ma'ata minority, not even in numbers. On the contrary, Yidden are a great majority and powerful, and they have nothing to fear, even numerically, for a great number of goyim. On the contrary, as we say in Oz Yosher, tipal aleim emosav pachad, a fear and a dread will fall upon them. But that happens when we stand all together as a unit. When Yidden stand united, then atem Nitzovim hayoim, all of you stand today, as Rashi explains, you stand firm, upright, meaning that you are zoiche bedin, you emerge right in your judgment. And that brings the Kstiva v'chastima toive on Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe doesn't mention it here, but it's well known from the Hayoim Yoim and many stichas that Hashem's blessing to us for the coming month and the coming year. What's his blessing this Shabbos Mevorachim? Hashem blesses the month with the words Atem Nitzovim Hayoim. You stand upright, Hayoim, on this special day of Rosh Hashanah, that is Zoiche Bedin, that brings the Kstiva v'Chastima Toive on Rosh Hashanah to every single Jew and Jewess with a good that's visible and obvious.